Right now, as you watch this, there is a voice in your head. Not a hallucination, not a disorder. A voice that has been running almost continuously since you were about 3 years old, commenting on what you are doing, rehearsing what you are going to say, arguing with people who are not in the room, narrating your own life back to you in real time. You probably call it thinking, but it is something far stranger than that. And the science of what that voice actually is, where it comes from, what it does, and what happens when it goes wrong, is one of the most revealing windows we have ever opened into what it means to be human. Here is what is actually happening inside your head. In the 1920s, a Soviet psychologist named Lev Vygotsky watched children play. He noticed something that had been overlooked for decades. Young children between the ages of 2 and 7 talk to themselves constantly while they work, not to anyone else, to themselves out loud, narrating what they are doing, instructing themselves through tasks, arguing with problems as they solve them. Psychologists at the time called this egocentric speech and assumed it was a sign of cognitive immaturity. A child who had not yet learned to keep their thoughts private. Vygotsky disagreed fundamentally. He argued that this out-loud self-talk was not a failure of development, it was the engine of development. The child talking to itself was using language as a tool to organize thought, to regulate behavior, to hold a goal in mind while executing the steps to reach it. And then, around age 7, the voice goes quiet. Not because it disappears, because it goes inward. What you experience as the inner voice, the silent running monologue in your head, is, according to Vygotsky, internalized speech. The same process that once happened out loud, now compressed, abbreviated, stripped of its social grammar and running silently inside the mind. You did not develop beyond self-talk. You just learned to do it privately. This framework, called the social development theory of language, fundamentally changed how psychologists understood the relationship between language and thought. Thought does not simply produce language. Language shapes thought. The inner voice is not a passenger reporting on what the mind is doing. It is an active participant in creating what the mind does. The neuroscience confirms this in remarkable ways. When you engage in inner speech, when you hear the voice in your head, brain imaging studies show activation in Broca's area, the region of the left frontal lobe historically associated with language production. The same region that fires when you speak out loud fires when you talk to yourself in silence. Your brain does not fully distinguish between speaking and thinking in words. The motor system for language partially activates even when no sound is produced. Psychologist Charles Fernyhough at Durham University has spent decades studying inner speech and has shown that it is far more complex than most people assume. In a 2011 study, he and his colleagues found that inner speech is not simply a reduced version of external speech. It is condensed, fragmented, and dialogic, meaning it often takes the form of a conversation, with multiple voices or perspectives playing out internally. You are not just narrating to yourself. You are in many cases holding an internal debate between different parts of your own perspective. This is why when you are wrestling with a difficult decision, it feels like two different people arguing inside your head. In a functional sense, that is exactly what is happening. But the inner voice does more than organize thought. Research shows it plays a central role in self-regulation. Psychologist Ethan Kross at the University of Michigan has done some of the most important work in this area. In a series of studies published between 2012 and 2017, Kross found that the language you use when you talk to yourself, specifically whether you use first-person or second- or third-person pronouns, has measurable effects on your emotional regulation, your performance under pressure, and your resilience to stress. When people facing a stressful task were instructed to talk to themselves using their own name rather than the word I, saying, "You can do this," or "Abdul Rahman, what do you need to focus on?" rather than "I can do this," they showed significantly lower anxiety, better performance, and faster emotional recovery after the event. Not because the advice was different, because the psychological distance created by referring to yourself in the third person allows the brain to process the situation more like a wise outside observer and less like a panicking participant. The way you talk to yourself changes what you are capable of. This also explains one of the most common and least understood mental health patterns. Aberdi, the relationship between inner speech and rumination. When the inner voice becomes stuck in a loop, replaying a conversation, catastrophizing about a future event, criticizing past behavior in repetitive cycles, it is not simply being negative. It is running a normal cognitive process, self-referential language and memory integration, in an environment where it cannot complete its function. The inner voice, under normal conditions, helps you process emotional events by narrating them, organizing them into a coherent story, and arriving at some kind of resolution or understanding. This is why talking about a problem, even to yourself, genuinely helps. The act of putting experience into words activates the left hemisphere's language processing and reduces activity in the amygdala, the brain's threat detector. Language literally calms the emotional brain. But when the narrative loops without resolution, the processing gets stuck. The same story is replayed, the same emotional activation fires, and no new understanding emerges. This is rumination, not a character flaw, a narrative process that cannot find its ending. Psychologist Susan Nolen-Hoeksema at Yale University, who spent decades studying rumination before her death in 2013, described it as the repetitive focusing on distress and its causes and consequences. Her research showed that people who ruminate are not simply thinking about problems more. They are locked in a kind of inner speech that magnifies negative emotion without moving toward resolution. The antidote, multiple studies have found, is not to silence the inner voice. It is to change the structure of what it is saying. Narrative expressive writing, as pioneered by psychologist James Pennebaker at the University of Texas, consistently reduces stress and improves well-being. Not because it empties the mind, but because it forces the inner narrative into a structure that moves forward. Beginning, middle, end, experience, meaning, resolution. The inner voice needs to go somewhere. When it circles, it hurts. When it moves, it heals. Now consider what all of this means for you. The voice you have lived with every waking hour of your life is not background noise. It is one of the primary instruments your brain uses to regulate emotion, organize behavior, rehearse social situations, make decisions, maintain identity, and process experience. It is the mechanism through which you hold a version of yourself together across time. When it is working well, you barely notice it. When it goes wrong, when it turns cruel, when it loops, when it tells you things about yourself that you cannot stop believing. It becomes the most intimate source of suffering available to the human mind. And when it is used skillfully, when you learn to shift the pronoun, to change the structure of the narrative, to treat yourself with the same voice you would use for someone you care about, it becomes one of the most powerful tools for change that exists. You have been talking to yourself since you were 3 years old. The only question is whether you have been listening to what you are saying.